Before I get started with my opening remarks, I'd like to acknowledge a few people in attendance today. First, Dr. Jackson, the president of Jessup. Second, Phil Escamilla, the vice president for academic affairs. And third, Kay Jovio, the dean of the School of the Humanities and the Arts. I want to take a moment to express my gratitude to the Intercollegiate Studies Institute for their invaluable support in bringing this lecture to fruition. Founded in 1953, ISI has been committed to the preservation of the fundamental principles that have allowed Western civilization to flourish. I'm grateful to be affiliated with an organization that encourages critical thinking, the cultivation of virtue, and that empowers students to engage with the pressing challenges of our time fearlessly and with a moral imagination. Thanks to ISI's unwavering dedication to truth and knowledge, we have the opportunity to champion the timeless ideals that make America exceptionally confidently. Today's lecture is one of many educational opportunities that ISI supports to help shape our nation's future leaders and foster a community of thoughtful, principled individuals. I invite each one of you to explore the rich intellectual resources ISI offers and join this community that is investing in the moral and intellectual excellence of students across the country. It's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Professor Mark David Hall. Mark is a professor in Regents University's Robertson School of Government, Director of Religious Liberty in the United States, a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University, and a senior fellow at Baylor University's Institute for the Studies of Religion. Professor Hall's academic journey began with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Wheaton College, followed by earning a doctorate in government from the University of Virginia. His scholarly contributions to the field of religion, law, and government are profound. He has written, edited, or co-edited 15 books that delve into these complex intersections. Among his notable works are Proclaim Liberty Through All the Land, How Christianity Has Advanced Freedom and Equality for All Americans, and Roger Sherman and the Creation of the American Republic. Today, Professor Hall will enlighten us with the insights from his latest work, Did America Have a Christian Founding? Separating Modern Myth from Historical Truth. Please join me in welcoming Mark David Hall.
Well, thank you, Peter, for that very generous introduction, and thank you, Alana, for helping to organize this. Let me just say I've been involved with ISI for probably 20 years, and I love the organization. I've been at their summer honors conferences, which are fantastic. And again, lots of interesting opportunities for book clubs and going to speakers and that sort of thing. So I highly encourage those of you who haven't joined yet to get on board. So today I'm going to address a question, did America have a Christian founding? And when I got into this business, what I found is there were two common answers. One set of answers, which I'm not as concerned about, are popular Christian authors like Parson Weems, who say, of course America had a Christian founding. All of America's founders were good, godly men. And maybe they're all evangelical Christians, and they self-consciously set out to create a Christian nation. Now, these folks, these popular Christian authors, usually without academic degrees, are usually more often right than they are wrong. But because they don't have academic training, they often make basic mistakes with citations and use quotations that can't be verified, and so it's really easy for scholars to dismiss them. But again, I'm not all that concerned about them. Some Christian scholars have already taken them to task, and again, I think they're more right than they are wrong. What I'm concerned about is what you see in most books on the American founding, books by scholars, books by popular authors. And these books tell a very common tale. America's founders were deists who set out to create a godless constitution, and they desired to strictly separate church and state. Now, these are folks at the best institutions in the land, places like the University of Chicago and Stanford. They're at Christian colleges like Messiah College, and they write these books that are just profoundly erroneous. I was talking with my Uber driver out here, and I'm not even sure he went to college, but he asked what I was talking about, and I explained to him, and he said, well, isn't it just obvious that Americans in the late 18th century were profoundly influenced by Christianity, and it should be. but it isn't to these guys. And what I do in my book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? I set up each chapter literally with about 15 quotations of scholars, not tweets, not blog posts, but scholars writing in books, or sometimes popular authors, but they oftentimes write, for very big presses, saying things like most of America's founders were deists, we have a godless constitution, and then I'd like to think what I do in my book is demolish these myths, by which in this context I mean a false story. And so I want to give you a taste of that today, and the way I want to begin is by interrogating the question, what would a Christian founding look like? I want to begin by focusing on the Christian there, and then I want to turn to consider when America was founded. Well, let me just say, I list a few possibilities here. One of the most obvious would be self-identification. America's founders identified themselves as Christians. If this is what we meant, then America indisputably had a Christian founding. Of Americans of European descent, 98% are Protestant, 2% are Roman Catholic, and about 1,400 Jews are in 4 or 5 American cities. So overwhelmingly, people who would have called themselves a Christian people. But I find this very uninteresting. These might have been bad Christians. They might have been heretical Christians. They might have been Christians setting out to create a secular political order. So I want to get beyond that. Now, I think it's far more interesting to ask, were they Orthodox Christians? Did they adhere to the basic tenets of the Nicene Creed? Now, I think I demolished the claim that most or many of them were deists, by which we mean a creator God who set the world in motion and stepped away from it. If that's what we mean by deism, I think 2 founders were deists, Ethan Allen and Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine really isn't even an American, right? He's from England. He spends most of his life over in Europe. But it's really hard to prove that most of them are Orthodox. I'm not saying you can prove they weren't Orthodox, but we just don't have the records. In a few cases, like Roger Sherman, we do, but in many cases, we just don't have records. We might know they're a member of a church, maybe even a vestryman, but that doesn't really get to the interior of their mind. It's been pretty popular for Christian historians to jump on this notion of orthopraxy. Did they act like Christians? And sometimes they'll say things, well, obviously, if America had a Christian founding, the founders would have immediately abolished slavery. They didn't do that, so they didn't act like Christians, so therefore America didn't have a Christian founding. In one of my more recent books, Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land, I argue that actually many founders had turned against slavery, many who freed slaves, who owned slaves freed them, many never owned slaves. They took a variety of steps to put slavery on the road to extinction. And so I think this is not a great argument. Among the worst arguments is they might point to someone like an Alexander Hamilton who had an extramarital affair and say, look at that. He had an extramarital affair, which he did. And that's a really bad thing to do. But if the test of being a Christian is moral perfection, then none of us are Christians, right? And so I don't find this particularly useful. What I end up landing at is this idea of Christian influence. And I argue that America's founders were influenced in profound ways by Christian ideas or by ideas developed within the Christian tradition of political reflection. And here my book fits in with many, many other books on America's founding, arguing that America's founders were influenced by a secularized Lockean liberalism, or the Scottish School of Moral Sense, or the common law tradition, or classical republicanism. So I'm really treading the same grounds. I'm just making a different argument that Christianity actually is the most dominant influence. All right, so that's what I mean by Christian. Let me shift gears a little bit and ask what we mean by founding. I think our minds immediately go to the late 18th century, but I do want to suggest that maybe we should be looking at the early colonies, because in some ways the story of America begins with these early colonial settlements from Massachusetts Bay down through Virginia, and you could look at these people and institutions and laws and constitutions, and they spent 150 years governing themselves before the imperial crisis, right? And so it might be useful to look at this. Well, if we look at the early colonies, I don't think anyone, even the worst, most aggressive secular historian is going to say the Puritans were not attempting to create a shining city on a hill. They're clearly rewriting laws, looking to the Bible as their guide. They're supporting the church. There's established churches. Heretics are banned, and Jesuits and Quakers are banned. I mean, these guys are clearly attempting to create a Christian commonwealth. Now, note, I'm not saying all of these policies are good. I think there's good Christian reasons to reject many of them. But at least in terms of what they thought they were doing, what they were trying to do, there's really not much of a question. What is a bit more interesting, though, is if we turn to some of the other colonies. Virginia, oftentimes, when you hear historians talk about early colonial America, they say, well, the New England's about God, but the southern colonies are about gold. Now, there's truth in both of that. You know, people immigrated to New England for economic concerns, but people in the South were concerned about the things of God as well. If you look at the 1610 Virginia Legal Code, it begins like this: whereas His Majesty, like himself a most zealous prince, has in his own realm a principal care of true religion and reverence to God, and has always strictly commanded his generals and governors with all his forces whatsoever to let their ways be like his ends for the glory of God. This is Virginia. And the articles go on to say you must attend church. If you blaspheme the Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit, you'll be put to death, and so forth. So even in Virginia, now what about the mid-Atlantic colonies? And I've had some fun with this. I taught at George Fox for many years. George Fox is, of course, the founder of the Quakers. William Penn founded Pennsylvania as a Quaker colony. And my Quaker colleagues would love to hold it up as a shining bastion of truth and beauty and liberty. And it is in many ways. It's a great colony. William Penn, George Fox, they deserve a lot of praise. But even in Pennsylvania, the charter references Romans 13. It quotes Romans 13 without a reference, actually. God is the origin of all government. And when you get on in the Article 37 of the laws of Pennsylvania, what we see is that the government should punish offenses against God, such as swearing, cursing, lying, profane talking, drunkenness, obscene words, incest, sodomy, stage plays, cards, dice, May games, gamesters, drafts, revel, bullbiting, cockfighting, bear baiting, and the like, which excite the people to rudeness, cruelty, looseness, and irreligion. Now, you have an established church in 9 of the 13 colonies. You don't have one in Pennsylvania, but you still have the government involved in punishing vice and encouraging virtue. You still have religious tests for office. You had those in every colony, actually. And again, I'm not saying these are good policies that we should have today, but if you're looking at the early colonies, I think it's hard to conclude anything other than these people thought they were creating Christian commonwealths. Well, my case might get a little more difficult when we get to the War for American Independence, because here you could say this is flying, the War for American Independence is flying in the face of the Bible, right? Romans 13 begins, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. So historically, Christians have taken these verses to say Christians never get to rebel against their civic leaders. If the civic leader tells you to do something like bow down and worship Baal, you refuse to do it, but then you take the consequences, just like we see in the Bible with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and others. So no rebellion. About 1,200 years the church had this position. However, the Protestant Reformation comes along, and especially the Reformed wing of the Reformation went in a very different way. John Calvin is oftentimes, we talk about the Reformed tradition being oftentimes used that synonymously with Calvin. Calvin is actually the most conservative of the reformers on this point. He says in his Institutes, the last edition of the Institutes, 1559, he says that inferior magistrates may properly, may justly, may biblically resist a superior magistrate who becomes a tyrant. Right? So he has in mind here maybe lords who would rise up against an emperor who becomes tyrannical. But we definitely don't want the people doing that. It has to be inferior magistrates. But even as he's writing this in the Institutes, you have John Knox up in Scotland saying, no, the people themselves have a duty to resist tyrannical authority. And when we look at this tradition, when we look at George Buchanan, Samuel Rutherford, Stephanus Junius Brutus, Theodore Beza, this tradition only evolves in this direction. So by the time you get to the War for American Independence, you have basically any Reformed Christian throughout the world is going to hold the position that inferior magistrates may resist a superior magistrate who becomes tyrannical, and if they don't act, the people themselves may rise up. Now, this is very important in the American context because between 50 and 75% of Americans of European descent, are reasonably called Reformed or Calvinist. And so this tradition, I would contend, had a lot to do with offering a biblical justification for revolting against the king. In my book, Proclaim Liberty, I have a nice long chapter where I engage in this debate, because just because you can revolt doesn't mean you should revolt. Governments are always doing things we don't like, maybe things that are immoral, maybe even things that are illegal. The bar has to be high, but I argue that the patriots met that bar. It was noticed by people on the other side, incidentally, who was supporting the War for American Independence. The loyalist Peter Oliver railed against, quote, the Black Regiment, the dissenting clergy who took so active a part in the rebellion. By dissenting, he means non-Anglican. He means Presbyterian, Congregationalist, and others. And these people, these ministers, were almost to a person in favor of the patriot cause, that is, Reformed ministers. Anglican ministers, on the other hand, split about 50-50, as you might expect, with the king being the head of the Church of England. King George himself referred to the war as the Presbyterian Rebellion. Let me suggest as well, on a normative plane, the most important document coming out of this war, which we're going to celebrate next year, especially in America's 250th anniversary, the central claim of this document: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, you might object that Thomas Jefferson is no Orthodox Christian, and I would agree with you. There's no question about that. However, Jefferson himself said in a letter in 1826 that he wasn't inventing anything in the Declaration. He was harmonizing the sentiments of the time. And he was a drafter of the Declaration. There's a committee of 5 that contained other people, including Roger Sherman, that old Puritan from Connecticut, and they made contributions. And then Congress made a variety of changes, many of which Jefferson didn't like. And so I always tell my students, with a document like the Declaration of Independence, you have to understand this is a product of a community. We can't look into Thomas Jefferson's mind to interpret what creator is. Maybe for Jefferson, creator was nature. I'm open to that argument. But when you look at the rest of the Continental Congress, there's no doubt it's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, if I can move on, so my first option for when America was founded were the early colonies. The second argument is 1776, and we're going to celebrate America's birthday next year, 250th birthday, so that might be a good one. There are some conservatives who actually don't like dating America to 1776. They want to say we really didn't become the United States of America as we're currently constituted until we get to the Constitution. And there are those who argue that the Constitution is a godless document. Oftentimes what they mean is just very simplistically, the deity is not mentioned in the Constitution, not till you get to the date line in the year of our Lord, 1787, but I think this is weak sauce, right? This is just simply a way of dating documents. Now, what I want to suggest is that, again, if we go back to the question of influence, we really aren't concerned with the number of references to God. We're interested in the possible influence of Christianity or the Bible upon the men who drafted and then ratified the U.S. Constitution. Before I get there, though, I do want to make one additional point, and this is a point made well by Donald Lutz, who did a wonderful content analysis of the political pamphlets of the founding era. He did this about 40 years ago, so he didn't have the technology we have today. So what he did is he went through a huge range of pamphlets, political pamphlets, and then he looked at who the founders were citing when they are making political arguments. So these aren't theological pamphlets, these are political pamphlets. And what he found is that they are just filled with references to the Bible. 34% of all citations are to biblical text, whereas only 22% are to all Enlightenment thinkers combined. So Montesquieu, Beccari, Smith, Locke, 22%. And Lutz profoundly undercounts the Bible for 2 reasons. First of all, he tells us that he leaves out election sermons if they don't also have citations to secular documents, but also he's literally looking for citations, Micah 4:4, Micah 6:8, that sort of thing, and yet the founders are routinely referencing the Bible, quoting the Bible, alluding to the Bible without giving the citations. And if we count those, and my friend Daniel Dreisbach does a great job of this in reading the Bible with the founding fathers, you'll find the Bible by far and away is the dominant text in this era. And this is exactly what you would expect of a bunch of Protestants, right, who believe in sola scriptura. All right, so that's just a broad point, but what I want to do is show a couple of ways, I think very specifically, that Christianity influenced the founders. The first and most obvious to me is that their faith taught them that men are sinful. Now, all Christians believe this to be the case, but remember, Calvinists emphasize the doctrine of total depravity. And so therefore, they feared concentrated power. They believed with Lord Acton that power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So they designed a constitutional order characterized by separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism. Enlightenment political thought is going exactly the opposite way at this time. Enlightenment thinkers believe that humans are perfectible, that they should be governed by wise experts with PhDs or the equivalent, and we should have a strong central government where these PhDs can push out truth to the masses, to the unwashed. Again, our political system looked almost the opposite of this. The founders were firm believers in the idea that there are moral standards, universal moral standards, which must be obeyed. An unjust law is no law at all, more than one of them would say. This is represented really well by James Wilson, one of the first Supreme Court justices, who gave one of the first series of law lectures in America. As an epigraph of his law lectures, he had this: law without liberty is tyranny. Tyranny without law is licentiousness. There's a distinguishing between a licentiousness and a true notion of liberty. Wilson, when you read through these lectures, you literally might think you're reading St. Thomas Aquinas. He makes distinctions like this. There are two types of law, divine and human. Of the divine law, there are four types: the celestial law, the physical law, the moral laws. I'm skipping over one. I can't read this well. But he goes on to say, let's celestial law, divine. Hold on, I lost it there. Let me make sure I get this. It's an important point. Well, I got the law. I confused myself on the law. But basically he says, there's a variety of laws, God's plan for the universe and so forth, physical laws, moral laws, and then human laws must be related to God's moral law. And he does say like Augustine, an unjust law is no law at all. Finally, the founders were convinced that humans are created in the imago Dei, the image of God, and therefore all humans are capable of acting with rationality. They should be treated with respect and dignity. We're capable of governing our own lives together. Now, here again, you could object, well, what about slavery? But I assure you, the founders are profoundly troubled by slavery. Many of them did very concrete things to do it. 8 states put it on the path to extinction or abolished it between 1776 and 1806. It was banned in the Northwest Territory. People recognized this was a problem. Unfortunately, the cotton gin came along and gave slavery a new lease on life in the American South. But the founders overall were very troubled by this because they understood that humans are created in the imago Dei. James Wilson, again, I'll quote him. My first book was actually on James Wilson. In a U.S. Supreme Court opinion, Jessup versus Georgia writes this: man, fearfully and wonderfully made, is the workmanship of his all-perfect creator. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because it's Psalm 139:1. And yet there's no citation here. So Donald Lutz wouldn't have caught a reference like this. In teasing this out, what does this mean? He gives some really specific implications. With the consistency, beautiful and undeviating, human life from its commencement to its close is protected by the common law. In the contemplation of the law, life begins with the infant is first able to stir in the womb. By the law, life is protected not only from immediate destruction, but from every degree of actual violence, and in some cases, every degree of danger. So the common law standard of when life begins in a woman's womb is when the woman can first feel it move. This is old science, though. I think if Wilson understood what we now understand about fetal development, he would say from conception to its natural end, human life must be protected. He addresses suicide. Now, today, a very common argument by advocates of suicide, that people should be permitted to commit suicide, is they ask, whose life is it? With the implication that it's my life, I get to choose. Wilson actually asked that same question, and he said, it's God's life, and therefore no one has a right to take God's life. So the implications of this are, I think, plentiful. All right, so thus far we've talked at a pretty abstract theoretical level, and I give a lot more evidence in my book. My wife always tells me to be a bit more practical, so I want to turn to something very practical that's been very practical since 1947. In 1947, in the U.S. Supreme Court case of Everson versus the Board of Education, both Wiley Rutledge, in his dissenting opinion, and Hugo Black, in his majority opinion, made it crystal clear that we must interpret the religion clause in light of the founders' views. Now, if you don't know these justices, they're actually two of the more progressive justices of the 20th century. So it's kind of interesting they're insisting on being originalist. But they pull a trick on us. This is an Establishment Clause case. And they go on to make the following argument. They say, well, the religion clause, the establishment clause must be understood in light of the founders' views. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison equal the American founders. Jefferson and Madison wanted the strict separation of church and state, a wall of separation of church and state. Therefore, the Establishment Clause requires a strict separation between church and state. And that's a very bad argument. And what I want to do in the few remaining minutes is I want to make an argument about what the First Amendment religion clauses were actually understood to mean. And this is the language we use nowadays. We used to talk about original intent, but now we talk more broadly about original understanding. So we aren't trying to peer into the mind of one founder or a multitude of founders that drafted this thing. We're looking at the public records, the debates over these texts, the newspapers debates to understand what did these folks understand these clauses to mean. And I think some three great consensuses come into focus. Now, we have to recognize, and it's taken as a criticism of originalism, that there were people who disagreed. Obviously, there were. Originalism, original understanding, does not require uniformity. So, for instance, to give the most obvious example, there were Federalists who wanted the Constitution to be ratified. There were Anti-Federalists who wanted it not to be ratified. Guess what? The Federalist won, and therefore that's what we go with. The Constitution is considered to be ratified. And so you can find people who disagree with the consensuses I'm going to speak about, and yet I want to suggest they are definitely in the minority. First of all, by the late 18th century, there had come to be a robust understanding of religious liberty. Religious liberty must be protected whenever possible, and this includes everyone, not just Protestants, but also Catholics and even Jews. A good example of this, and incidentally, I believe they came to this conclusion for biblical and Christian reasons, theological reasons, not prudential ones, not because they read Locke's letter on toleration. They're Christian reasons. A good example of this might be found in George Mason's draft of what became Article 16 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. This is how it begins. This is a draft. It changes a little bit, but listen to the argument. There is an argument here that as religion or the duty which we owe to our divine and omnipotent Creator, and the manner of discharging it can be governed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, and therefore all men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion. What I want you to note first is this is an argument grounded in a claim that we have a duty to our divine and omnipotent Creator. So he's not saying now that we're rational, we can have religious liberty. He's not saying we're tired of killing each other, so we can have religious liberty. He's saying we have a duty to worship God, and this duty must be exercised freely. Now, this is not a bad text, I would suggest, but young James Madison, in one of his first public acts, he stands up and he objects to this language of toleration. He said toleration makes it sound like this is a gift of the government. And instead, he suggested a change to make it clear that we have a natural right to the free exercise of religion. The convention went along with Madison, and Article 16 was changed. And of course, eventually, we have a First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that protects not freedom of belief, not freedom of worship, but the free exercise of religion. All right, let me go on to established churches, because again, you might say, well, look, Hall, if America had a Christian founding in this late 18th century, why are colonies getting rid of established churches? Colonies now states. Why are they getting rid of established churches? And there is a logic to established churches. So in Virginia, for instance, during the war, the government got out of the business of taxing people to support the Anglican Church, and then they clearly exempted Presbyterians and Baptists altogether. And this was worrisome. It was really worrisome to Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry basically argued, look, religion, Christianity, is so important that the state should support it with tax dollars. But he came up with a very generous form of an establishment. It's called a plural establishment. He said, basically, why don't we tax Presbyterians to support their Presbyterian churches? We'll tax Anglicans to support their Anglican churches, and so on. So that's not unreasonable. Germany does something much like this to this very day. There were clergy. There's a wonderful set of petitions that arrived on the same day from Westmoreland County. Let me read this one first. The one was making an argument much like Henry that says basically, I'm going to paraphrase it says basically we want the best and the brightest young men to become ministers. Therefore, we need to be able to pay them a good salary. If we don't pay them a good salary, they'll go off and become doctors or merchants or lawyers. All right? We hear arguments like that today with respect to public sector unions, right? All right, so there's a logic behind that, but here's a petition that arrived from Westmoreland County against this. This petition claims that assessments were against the spirit of the gospel. The holy author of our religion did not require state support. The holy author of our religion, Jesus Christ, that Christianity was far purer before Constantine first established it by human laws. They rejected this argument about basically bribing young men to become pastors, and they said that clergy should manifest to the world that they are inwardly moved by the Holy Ghost, take upon them that office, that they seek the good of mankind and not worldly interest. Let their doctrines be scriptural and their lives upright. Then shall religion, if departed, speedily return, and deism be put to open shame, and its dreaded consequences removed. You see the argument? The argument is we don't want ministers to be motivated by money. We need to get the government out of the business of religion, and this will cause true Christianity to flourish. James Madison turned in his memorial and remonstrance in this same debate. If you've read any document from this era, it's probably been the memorial and remonstrance that's sometimes treated as an Enlightenment sort of attack on assessments. But even Madison, he writes in this document that ecclesiastical establishments, instead of maintaining the purity and efficacy of religion, have had a contrary operation, and the bill is adverse to the diffusion of the light of Christianity. So even Madison's arguing that this sort of government involvement in religion hurts Christianity. Now, you might object that, well, maybe Madison's just making this for rhetorical purposes. I'm not sure there's good evidence to support this, but even if he was, if he's making an argument to be rhetorically effective, he thinks it will be effective, right? He thinks Virginians will be swayed by it, and they were. They ultimately ended up turning down Patrick Henry's proposal. This evangelical petition that I quoted from first was actually 3 times as popular as Madison's memorial and remonstrance, and yet you find this in no constitutional law book and no history book, and that's a real shame. All right, so the founders are in fact turning against religious establishments basically because they think they hurt true Christianity. Now, some hold on longer than others. Massachusetts was the last state with an establishment, finally ended 1833. Well, let me end by talking about religion in the public square. In 1802, Thomas Jefferson penned a famous letter to the Danbury Baptist Association where he suggested that the First Amendment creates a wall of separation between church and state. Now, I want to interrogate this a little bit. First of all, I must point out that Jefferson did not help write the First Amendment. He was not even in America at the time. He didn't help ratify the First Amendment. So while we should look to him as making the defining statement about what the First Amendment means is a bit beyond me. This metaphor stayed dormant with respect to the Establishment Clause until 1947 when it was picked up by Wiley Rutledge and Hugo Black in the Everson versus the Board of Education decision. Now, what I want to suggest is that I want to take the hardest case. Jefferson wanted a greater degree of separation between church and state than almost any other founder. So I want to begin with him and ask if this metaphor even reflects well on what he did as a public official. So when Jefferson was governor of Virginia, he revised Virginia statutes and he drafted bills stipulating when the governor could appoint days of public fasting and humiliation or Thanksgiving. And he actually issued a proclamation encouraging Virginians to pray and fast when he was governor of Virginia. And he also helped draft a law for punishing people who disturb religious worship and Sabbath breakers. As a member of the Continental Congress, he came up with the national seal, a draft what he thinks the national seal should be. The people of Israel fleeing Pharaoh pursuing and into the Red Sea, Moses holding his hands out, and the Red Sea, of course, swamping Pharaoh. And his motto, Thomas Jefferson's motto for the United States of America would have been, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. He ended his second inaugural address by encouraging all Americans to join him in seeking, I'm quoting, the favor of that being in whose hands we are, who led our forefathers as Israel of old. And I think this is particularly interesting. Literally 2 days after he finished his letter to the Danbury Baptist, he went to church services in the U.S. Capitol building where he heard John Leland, the great Baptist itinerant minister, and himself an opponent of religious establishments, preach. Jefferson also made the War Department building and the Treasury Department building available for church services. Now, what I'm trying to suggest is not that Jefferson wanted a union between church and state. He didn't. But even Jefferson, in his public life, I should say, did not act as if there was a wall of separation between church and state. I think clearly he wanted the government to get out of the business of telling churches how to govern themselves, dictating matters of doctrine. He wanted to get the government out of the business of taxing people to support churches. There's no doubt about that. But he did not actually, even though he used the metaphor of the wall of separation between church and state, he did not act as if there were anything like that wall. Certainly not the wall that the Americans United for Separation of Church and State would have us build. Now, if we leave Jefferson and go to the broader constellation of founders, we see a very different image that comes to mind. So we can look at the First Continental Congress. This is the first Federal Congress. This is the Congress that drafted the First Amendment. One of the first things it did before it drafted the First Amendment, though, was it decided to have chaplains, one for the House, one for the Senate. It decided to pay those chaplains. It passed a Northwest Ordinance, which, among other things, reauthorized the Northwest Ordinance, that holds that religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Now, even more significant, I think, is, again, literally one day after the House arrived at its final language for the First Amendment. Remember, this is hammered out in the House and the Senate. The House comes to its final language for what becomes the First Amendment. It begins, in case we don't all remember, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The first clause is the Establishment Clause. So right after it got done hammering that out, Elias Boudinot, who later became president of the American Bible Society, he stood up and he said, I'm going to paraphrase, but he said, hey guys, things are going well. Why don't we ask George Washington to issue a Thanksgiving Day proclamation? Adonias Burke of South Carolina said, oh no, we can't do that. That's a European practice. Roger Sherman, that old Puritan from Connecticut, said, no, it's a biblical practice, and therefore it's the one that we should engage in. So the House agrees with Boudinot and Sherman. The Senate agrees with the House. Collectively, Congress asked President Washington to issue a Thanksgiving Day proclamation, and he did. And it's a wonderfully theologically rich one. It begins, whereas it is a duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and to humbly implore His protection and favor, I do recommend to the people of the states, to the service of the great and glorious being who is a beneficent author of all that is good, that was, that is, or that will be. Note two things here. First of all, Washington, like everyone else, talks about a duty to worship God. And second of all, note that he's only recommending to the people. He's not ordering the people. He's not telling the people they have to pray because he believes in religious liberty. He believes in disestablishment. But there's nothing wrong with the president recommending something. And therefore, we should all unite in most humbly offering our prayers and supplications to the great Lord and ruler of nations, and beseech Him to pardon our national and other transgressions. So presidents still issue Thanksgiving Day proclamations. Joe Biden issued 4 of them, but none of them talk about people begging God for the forgiveness of our sins. This is, I think, a fairly sophisticated document. It's not just rah-rah America, we're God's chosen people. He's thanking God for what is good and begging forgiveness for for the sins that we have done. All right, so similar proclamations were routinely issued by the Continental Confederation Congress, by President Washington, by President Adams. Jefferson, it's true, thought presidents shouldn't issue such proclamations, but James Madison, who probably didn't want to, issued 4, and most presidents have done so since then. All right, so I want to be crystal clear. America's founders are turning against religious establishments. They don't want governments telling churches how to govern themselves, what doctrines to have. They don't want telling people they have to go to church. They don't want to ban certain dissenters. But they are not embracing anything like the sort of strict separation between church and state that would, for instance, have religious memorials like crosses and monuments of the 10 Commandments on public land shut down, or prohibit students going to Jessup for receiving federal student aid and that sort of thing. All right, so by way of conclusion, let me return to the question, did America have a Christian founding? Well, history is complex, and I think we need to be careful with this. So in answering yes, I think we do need to make it crystal clear what we mean by a Christian founding. And I would also distinguish between America having a Christian founding and being founded as a Christian nation. I actually don't like that language. That makes it sound like it's very exclusive, like we're a nation of and for Christians, and maybe we'll put up with non-Christians and maybe we won't. The founders made it crystal clear that everyone is welcome to be an American citizen. One of my favorite documents from this era that makes this crystal clear is George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. Remember, I said there's about 1,400 Jews in America, 4 or 5 cities. Newport, Rhode Island is one of them. They have no political power in this era, no economic power. They write Washington a letter congratulating him on becoming president and such. He writes them back in 1790, and he writes this: all citizens alike possess alike liberty and conscience and the immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of. Let me highlight that again. That's that whole toleration, religious liberty debate. We don't tolerate the Jews. You have a right, a natural right to the free exercise of your religion. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions that effectual support. So again, and this is not just one letter by Washington. Article 6 of the Constitution bans religious tests for office. Anti-federalists complained, oh my goodness, this means a Jew or a Muslim or even an atheist could hold federal office, and the Federalists had to agree. Now, they usually would go on to say, well, it probably won't happen, and it certainly didn't seem like it would happen in the 18th century, but the principle was there, and clearly Americans are moving in this direction. Now, we struggle. We lapsed into anti-Catholic bigotry in the 19th century. Jehovah's Witnesses were beaten up all the time in the early 20th century. So I'm not saying it's always been perfect, but I think that the seeds are there, the idea is there, religious liberty for all must be robustly protected. But listen to how Washington concludes this letter, this wonderful letter, making it absolutely clear that Jews are here on equal terms with everyone else. He writes, may the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercy scatter lights and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy. There are 6 separate references, allusions, or quotations of Scripture in that last paragraph alone, including to George Washington's favorite verse, Micah 4:4. That's an eschatological verse about everyone sitting in safety under his own vine and fig tree. He quoted this more than 40 times in public documents and private documents. He never put citations after it. And so Donald Lutz would have missed all of these citations. And again, I give you that as evidence that these guys are doing this literally all the time. So I think America did have a Christian founding, and I think this is very good news for all Americans. All Americans benefit from the separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism. All Americans, whether Christians or not, benefit from a very robust understanding of religious liberty that protects all of us. All right, so thank you very much. Objections are welcome.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, son? Okay. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask Professor Hall? If not, I got one. Professor Hall, our ISI club, we are doing a book club on Leo Strauss's Natural Right in History. And one of the questions that we posed in our first session was America founded with the concept of natural rights in mind? And going along with was it founded on Christian principles, we were uncertain of what the answer to that was. Do you have any insight on that?
Yes, I do, and I could speak for a long time about that. So it's my understanding that the Straussians take the moderns to veer off in a very different direction when it comes to natural rights. They believe that natural rights are basically grounded in self-interest. They take this from a reading of Thomas Hobbes, which really makes quite a bit of sense, Leviathan, and a very contested reading of John Locke. And so ultimately these rights are basically about self-preservation, and they're arguably at odds with some of the fundamental teachings of Christianity. I come from a different school. I believe that the idea of subjective natural rights that adhere to individuals really were developed in the Christian tradition as early as the 13th century, and that it continues to be developed within Protestantism and Reformed theology even more specifically. So if you read something like Vindicia Contra Tyrannos, he clearly talks about the rights individuals have, including the right to resist tyrannical authority, and he's writing this 100 years before Locke. And so I think the founders did embrace natural rights, but they're natural rights that are grounded in the Christian tradition, that are grounded on the natural law, the Christian conception of natural law. So the Straussians often go off in a very different direction in their interpretation of the American founding than I do. Now, Leo Strauss himself didn't do a lot of work on America at all, but he does have followers who have done that. And they oftentimes try to paint a profound tension between the founders and Christianity. They argue, and oftentimes someone like a Michael Zuckert will make the argument, yeah, the Puritans were trying to create a Christian commonwealth, but this is clearly rejected by the founders. One of the things with the Straussians, you don't have to look at the broad range of founders. You can find a few philosophical geniuses within them, and so we can just focus real carefully on Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin. And when you do that, you get a very distorted view of the founding. These guys were, in fact, more influenced by the Enlightenment than almost any Americans. They weren't Orthodox Christians. But again, they're very unrepresentative. Ben Franklin spent over half of the last 35 years of his life over in Europe. Jefferson spent significant time in Europe. They are not representative Americans. They're great Americans. They're great Americans, but not representative Americans. Yes, sir.
Just real quickly, thank you for the tour de force, and remind me to never debate you in any public setting. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. It was wonderful. Thank you, Professor. Quick question. When you think about people like Aquinas and Anselm, what you alluded to just briefly, you think about American history and you think about the founding, you mentioned Brown versus Board of Education, one of your things. How could the same Supreme Court decide Plessy v. Ferguson, not the same, but the same stream of intellectual, cultural thinking, decide Plessy v. Ferguson, and then reverse it in Brown v. Board of Education? Talk about Christian influence and how it ebbs and flows in culture in light of your observations.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to try to get to this indirectly and make a fun point, which I spell out in a large degree in Proclaim Liberty Throughout the Land, where I'm stealing from Philip Hamburger, the great Columbia law professor. So if I'm right about the founding, then an obvious question is, well, where did this idea that there should, in fact, be a strict separation of church and state comes from? And what Hamburger argues, and I think he's right, is he says it comes from the profound anti-Catholic animus that sweeps America in the mid-19th century through the mid-20th century. And so the problem is you have hardly any Catholics in the American founding. They start coming over in waves in the 1820s, and they scare Protestants, right? They're afraid that they're going to listen to the Pope, obey the Pope. There are papal encyclicals at the time that seem pretty much against religious liberty, freedom of speech, democracy. And so you get more and more Catholics, up to 25% of the population. And once public schools come on the scene in the 1820s, so everyone has to go to a public school, even Horace Mann, he understood public schools as having a very important function of creating Christian citizens. And so therefore we'll have prayer, and we'll have Bible reading, and we'll let the Bible speak for itself. And we'll read the King James Version of the Bible. Now, to him, that seemed very fair and neutral. But for Catholics, it's a very Protestant way of teaching religion. And so they started saying after the Civil War, hey, here's a fair deal. Why don't you give us a share of our tax dollars, and then we'll have Catholic schools, and you guys can keep your public schools, which are really Protestant schools. And so at this point, James Blaine proposed an amendment to the U.S. Constitution saying that basically no state shall ever give money to a sectarian institution, but sectarian here means Catholic, not religious, right? The Blaine Amendment failed at the national level, but it became the law of many states. Many states adopted this. And this profound anti-Catholic animus continued well into the 20th century. So I've been up in Oklahoma for 20 years or so. In 1922, the voters of Oklahoma decided to ban private schools. Every single private school in the state but one was a Roman Catholic school. And that's amazing. Now, so you get to Everson versus the Board of Education. In Everson versus the Board of Education, one of the lead authors, Hugo Black, a member of the KKK, a member of the Masons, and a great fan of Blanchard, Paul Blanchard. In fact, his son, I quote a letter from him that basically, my dad and the Klan basically didn't see eye to eye on most anything except the Roman Catholic Church. And if you read some of the concurrences in Everson, they're just openly anti-Catholic. And so, again, I think you have this broad Christian influence in America, but here's an example where I think, largely Protestants got caught up in an irrational fear of the Roman Catholic Church that led them to embrace this notion that there should be a strict separation of church and state. Now, 1960s come along, you have Vatican II, you have John F. Kennedy, you have a variety of things that start bringing Catholics and Protestants together. When you had the school prayer decisions in 1962, 1963, now all of a sudden Americans are like, what in the heck? We never wanted this. We never wanted prayer taken out of the public school, Bible reading taken out of the public school. 49 of 50 governors opposed this. 276 constitutional amendments were introduced to repeal these decisions. So I'm getting at this in a long way to say that's how I think this court came to embrace these principles that then we've had to fight about for the last 50 years. Now, if I can shift over to race, I do think, as I've already suggested, you had Christians in the founding era doing very important things to oppose slavery. You get to the 19th century, we all know about the abolitionists motivated by their faith to oppose slavery. Unfortunately, again, some Christians, I would say, deceived themselves and made pro-Christian arguments, biblical arguments in favor of slavery, and we eventually had to resolve the issue in a bloody civil war. So Christians, those Christians making arguments in favor of slavery, I'm not prepared to say they aren't Christians. I would say they're Christians who are in error. When you get to the specific Supreme Court decisions you mentioned, I'm not sure it's actually a matter of faith that pushed them to make those decisions. I think it's a matter of constitutional interpretation. At least that's what we'd like to think. Let me close by saying this. Nino Scalia made it crystal clear when he was a justice that his duty was to interpret the Constitution. And he said, if my interpretation of the Constitution ever went against my Christian faith, I would resign as the Supreme Court justice. And I think he even gave the example of abortion. If I thought the Constitution required a right to have an abortion, I would resign rather than rule in favor of that, but it doesn't, so I didn't have to. So again, this is what I'd like to think Christian jurists do. Again, I want the light of Christ to shine on everything we do, but I do think jurists have institutional responsibilities to interpret constitutions, interpret statutes. That was a long-winded question, but it was a very long-winded answer to a very interesting question. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more quick question, if someone has one.
Thank you, Pete. Maybe I'll see if I can complicate a few things for you.
Yeah, all right.
For me, Vinny Ginda, and I'm in law enforcement, so I look at things in terms of context, and when you use the word interrogate several times, I guess in my world it means something a little different. But when I look at what the original founding fathers, what their ideals were, you look at the original documents, there's a lot of references to Galatians, Romans, there's a lot of direct references to biblical text, even to the Old Testament Moses law. And when we look at the population of what the U.S. was at that time, maybe 3 to 5 million in the 13 colonies, I think the world population during that time may have been close to 800 million or so. But I guess I argue that I don't see where it wouldn't have a foundation in the Christian faith, because there are so many references to it. There's no references to the Quran. There's no references, well, when we look at the Torah, the first 5 of the books of the Bible or of the Torah are in the Bible as well. So I guess maybe I'm just a little confused as to the pushback that you see. What seems to be the biggest argument that you face, aside from the idea of slavery? What are other arguments that you see that it's not Christian-based?
Yeah, thank you. So again, there's book after book after book on this sort of subject. I'll just go back to my little slide with a number of these books, but by far and away not most of them. And so what these folks will argue is that, well, the founders weren't Orthodox Christians. They were deists. Matthew Stewart, the author of this book, Nature's God, is a very smart guy. He's a Rhodes Scholar. This is published by Norton. And he actually says it's too much to call them deists. They're actually atheists. They're all closet atheists, or at least the important ones are closet atheists. And they then go on to say these guys are drawing from Enlightenment ideas to create, again, a godless constitution. And further, they go on to argue that the founders wanted to strictly separate church and state. So how do you get there in light of all the biblical references and citations? First of all, again, it's depending on what you're talking about. Some documents like the U.S. Constitution don't really reference God, and they don't really contain scriptural quotations, right? So it kind of becomes easy to say, look, it's a godless document there. To the extent to which God appears as deity does in the Declaration of Independence, they say that's just there for window dressing. It really wasn't important. And then in terms of a more positive view of where these where the intellectual influences are coming from, basically it's the Enlightenment, but that version of the Enlightenment that's most antithetical to Christianity. So some versions are much more favorable towards it, others really want to undermine it. At best, and again, oftentimes these guys say that, well, the founders weren't against religion per se, as long as you just kind of kept it to yourself, go to your church and worship, and that's fine. But we don't need any religion in the public square, and we want to strictly separate. Let me make one last point. Just think for a moment about the words of the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. But think about the metaphor of a wall of separation between church and state. The words of the Establishment Clause are clearly a unilateral barrier. They're a restriction on Congress, and by extension, the states, right? But a wall is a bilateral barrier. It would keep the government out of the business of the church, which we all like, but it would keep the church out of the business of the government. But the Establishment Clause doesn't say that, but that's what these sorts of authors want to do. They want to make it seem illegitimate for Christians to bring their faith into the public square to argue for things using religious language. But even if they don't use religious language, still, if they're motivated by faith, they should not do this. Yes, I think that's the arguments. I don't think they're good arguments, but those are the ones that are often made.